What'd you say?
Do you need to talk to them?
Do we need to talk to you? Have any questions? Chris, do we have any deficits?
Don't mess my thing up.
So I will turn you loose with Randy. Another exciting presentation.
It's as exciting as it can be.
That's pretty good. So, Randy, you're up.
So the second presentation that Jeff had asked me to do was to talk about the hydrogeology of Venice.
You can make that exciting. You can do anything.
Well, and so this didn't go nearly the way I expected it to. Because, Venice is an island. it sits out in the ocean. So its hydrogeology is really just tidally influenced. But there is a lot of other things that I did find out. So it didn't quite go the way I thought it would. If we could go back in time a little bit, Pleistocene glaciation, the area of the northern Adriatic here on the screen was all dry. Sea level rose considerably, 100 meters at the end of the Pleistocene. And Venice probably existed as part of the continent prior to 6,000 years ago and didn't really exist as an island until a couple thousand years ago. Yeah, good point, Colin. Thanks for bringing me back to the truth. I appreciate that. Yeah.
I can only remember back 35 years.
I am glad this is a geology class and not an archaeology class, because the amount of debate on when Venice was first inhabited and by whom is a huge can of worms. Most people agree that it was inhabited by the time the Roman Empire fell. People fleeing small Roman villages as the Germanic tribes and then later the Huns came down through this area. The newly formed embayment, and when I say newly formed, we're talking in geological time here. The newly formed lagoon, which we're going to zoom in on here a little bit more, offered really good protection because the Germanic tribes, they did not want to take the time to make their way out into the lagoon to attack, Venezia or any of the other islands out there, and there are hundreds of these little islands out there. In fact, the island of Venice is actually like 100, depending upon what articles you read, it's 116 islands or as many as 124 islands. That one, and there's a little animation that we'll look at on YouTube in a little bit, if we can make that kind of shows that it was these little spots, and then the spots got bigger and bigger and coalesced, and the canals are simply the space left in between these really small islands. So as far as the archaeology, yeah, really difficult. About 500 years ago, 15 or 1600 AD, several of the major rivers, most notably the Po and the Brenta, were diverted by the city of Venice. They're major silt carriers, and they were silting up the lagoon. The lagoon was filling with water, or filling with sediment, and if speculation is that if it had, by engineers, is that if they hadn't done that and diverted those two rivers, as well as some smaller ones that are probably meaningful, but not nearly as meaningful as the Po and the Brenta, that you'd probably be able to walk to Venice from the mainland without the need of the bridge causeway. That 500 years of constant sediment. I mean, imagine if the Mississippi River was dumping sediment into this small area right here for the past 500 years. How far out would the delta have prograded? Probably a considerable amount, especially considering that it's protected back here behind these really, really nice linear longshore drift barrier islands that are created by all this sedimentation that goes on. So the rivers come out to the north and south on the north end and the south end of the embayment. So it is silting up, all of this right here, and some of the water gets taken all the way out. But one of the rivers did come out just right here, and then they diverted it, which, 500, 600 years ago, that's quite an engineering feat in and of itself to move the outfall of a major river. There are lots of islands. Yes?
So they wanted to keep Venice an island?
Yes, they did, for protection. Yeah, it's a natural, the water, especially from big invading armies that were on horseback, they did not want to get off the horses. They didn't want to wade through the goo and the muck out to these little inhabited islands out there, to 10, 20,000 people, whatever was out there today. It's like 80,000 on Venice, I believe, and 240,000 if you looked at the entire, landmass that inhabits the bay, or not the bay, the lagoon. We're going to use the correct terminology. That is the Venice Lagoon. So they wanted it to stay an island. They did. They didn't want it to be part of the mainland. They liked the canals. They liked what that offered them. They liked the natural seaport, etc., etc. Back in the day, the Grand Canal, which we'll all become familiar with when we are there, as well as a little bit today, was big enough to take the largest ships available at the time. So 500-600 years ago, the biggest ships there were could go right up into the middle of downtown, where the Rialto Bridge is now located, etc. So they wanted it. So 114 on the low end, 124 on the high end. We kind of split the difference a little bit. 117 individual islands make up Venice itself, and we're not going to go through any of these, but these are all considered. I don't speak Italian. These are all considered part of the lagoon, so they're all part of Venice, and Venice is actually the capital of this region of Italy. And there's some 200 named, not necessarily inhabited islands that make up the lagoon. And in the illustration here, as well as in the picture, you can see the really, really well-pronounced, barrier islands, really nicely developed longshore current. The Grand Canal, which you can begin to make out in this Landsat, is right here. It's a backwards S. You come across on the train or the barrier. Where exactly are we staying, Chris?
We're staying just off the island, just a little bit.
Over in here?
On the island.
Oh, we're not on the island. We're over in here.
Put your hand up there again, and then come this down, straight down.
Somewhere in here? Okay. So you make your way out and get off of the train or the mass transit, etc. Okay. Yeah, there is a bus parking. Gotcha. One of the things I read was that they said, on a daily basis, some of the really big hotels that are clear, the place you want to go is clear over here. This is the San Marco Square. This is where the tourist stuff and the pictures that you see, on the internet, and this is where all of that is at. And there's a bunch of really high-end hotels around the square that are right on the canal system. And one of the things that one of the hotels said, it's every day we get phone calls asking about, how much, does it cost to park our car at the hotel? So once you've crossed the bridge, this is as far as any vehicle with wheels on it can go. There is no motorized vehicles in the entire rest of the island because of the canals. The bridges are only for foot traffic, and the bridges are not as numerous as one might hope. And a lot of the times you'll be walking on a pretty major, what you would consider a major road or a major, footpath, and then you'll turn a corner and boom, there's the canal, and there's steps going down into the water. No bridge, so you've got to backtrack and find another way to get across the water, or there's just a wall and it's just a dead end.
I was going to say, just because I'm thinking about it now, one thing Danny Olson, who's going with us, said is take the...
Danny Olson is right there.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
And we have to introduce him. We should have introduced him before. Go ahead, Chris.
He was saying, take the, what is it called, water taxi?
Yeah, the public water transit.
Public water taxi is way cheaper than Amazon.
Yeah, a gondola down the Grand Canal from one end to the other will cost about 80 to 100 euros, depending on time of year. Where the public water taxi, you can get an all-day pass for it for like $14 or something like that.
We're going to have Danny talk about logistics.
Gotcha.
He and I went out there, when was it, 4 or 5 years ago, and he kind of published a book.
Very cool.
On he and I's adventures. We'll give him the last 2 minutes.
Really? And you can put that you can talk about that at BYU?
Yes.
Nice. I like that. All right.
Cleaned up.
Zoom in a little bit more. The barrier island is broken in 3 places, and this creates some issues because, Venice is in the lagoon, and the lagoon is controlled by tides. So when the tide goes in, the water level rises. When the tides go out, the water level falls, hence the reason for the steps when you get to the edge of the concrete and it goes down. There's steps there because sometimes you can step right off onto the boat, and sometimes the tide might be 30 or 40 centimeters lower than that or bigger. They have some major tidal extremes that we'll talk about today. But from this picture, especially for those of you who've been on the Bahama field trip, you can see those are really pretty nicely, those are really nice tidal channels. Now, the Grand Canal and some of the other drainages, including these tidal channels, it's speculated that those are river valleys, that during the Pleistocene, when the Adriatic was that way quite a ways, that river meandered right through the landmass, creating the backwards S-curve of the Grand Canal, and then further out and dumped into the Adriatic, further down the coastline, and now sea level has risen, and the canal is still there. And that's not an artificial feature. In fact, really none of the canals in Venice are truly artificial in that they went in and dug very many of them. As the islands grew and got bigger over centuries, they coalesced together, and the canals were just the space that was in between. And they do dredge out the Grand Canal, not as often as they should, from what I understand. And there are points in time back in the early 1980s where it had been about 25 years since they had dredged the canal, and there were places where you couldn't get big boats through, and small canals you couldn't get gondolas through. And then they spent about a decade dredging everything, and now everything's on a nice rotation where about every decade everything gets dredged and cleaned and repaired, and we'll show you some of the reason for that. So they have these three big inlets. Well, there's our picture. And so in a minute, we'll pull up this little video clip if we can, and we'll try to show you what it looked like prior. So yeah, mostly built on existing structures. The channels are simply what remains between the islands, and when they built the islands or enlarged them, it's what gives us this structure right here. All right, so these inlets all have names. And as the tide approaches, especially if there is an onshore wind, we can push a tremendous amount of water incrementally through these inlets, because the tide doesn't raise, simultaneously at all of the inlets. It moves down from north to south generally, and the wind can actually blow quite a bit of water through. So the Lido Inlet can create some serious problems for Venice, especially at high tide. And the highest tides occur in November. So we're lucky that we're not going in November, because I'll show you some pictures from November of the past couple of years. Once the water is in and the tide has moved south, it starts to drain back out, but then we start to pump water back in at the south, and we can have some extreme high tides. So parts of Venice, because the water is going in and out of these inlets during the tidal fluctuation, can actually begin to flood. And during the winter months, November especially, it's actually pretty common for that's the lagoon. And they're sitting in, and I will not try it. The name of St. Marcos Square, what's the big square down in St. Marcos Square? That's where they're at right here. So this is the area with all the cobblestone pavement and everything, and that's mid-November. In 2013, the square flooded weekly for a month and a half. And sometimes the water is only ankle deep, not a big deal. And there are sirens that go off, and they tell everybody, especially, the locals all know what's happening. They say, board up your, try to make it so the water can't come into the door of your shop or the door of your house. Numerous of the private homes on the island, people have abandoned the first floor and only live on the upper floors now, because it has become increasingly more often that these types of pictures are taken. So yeah, and some of these are just really cool. They're still setting up the chairs. He's got his thigh waders on, and you go on the internet and you'll see pictures of the locals walking around in their waders, and then you'll see pictures of the tourists with like little flimsy garbage bags over their feet with duct tape around the tops, trying to keep their feet dry. And they put out boardwalks like with milk crates, and there's 10,000 people, because it's like millions and millions of tourists a year, and they've got these boardwalks set up, where it's about 20 inches wide on these things that look like milk crates, and 10,000 people are trying to cross from one side of the street to the other, and there's almost like a police officer with his hip waders on, standing there in the water, telling everybody to just keep moving, because all the tourists, of course, want to take pictures and do all sorts of other stuff like fish, and yeah, but what you really should be doing is just having dinner, just find it. That's just really funny. So we're going to take just a moment and look at a little of the flooding, because, oops, went the wrong way, going backwards. Although it's not going to let me do that. So there we go. We'll see which one this was. I was going to go through all of this again just prior to coming, but my daughter had to go to the hospital, so it all got a little bit delayed. Please be the right video. There we go. And the sound is, Jeff's going to take care of it. And the computer, there we go. So they've got you saw the little piece of plywood, the pieces of wood there in the doorways. Those are caulked in place after the sirens go off, trying to keep the water out of their home. This area here in between the people and the streetlights, you should be able to walk on. That should be dry ground. But look, on the bright side, there's nobody waiting to sit on the benches. You can just walk right over and have one of those.
So is this wind mainly pushing the tide?
The wind is helping the tides come in, yeah. So I'm going to turn the tidal fluctuation is usually between 25 and 50 centimeters. The highest tide they've measured is like at 118 centimeters. So normally tides coming, low tide to high tide, we're coming up about 50 centimeters. Well, that's okay. Everybody's fine. But when it comes up 118 centimeters, it looks like this. And it's becoming more and more of a problem as time goes on because one, Venice is sinking, and two, sea level is rising. Both are happening at a rate of about 2 millimeters a year. So we've got 4 millimeters a year of increase in Venice because of the problem. All right, so you kind of get the picture that if you were going in November, you might want to pack different clothes. Yeah, it's just a good time. Everybody there is happy. They're all having a great time, especially this couple. The first time this happened, spring runoff was really, really low. Drought conditions, kind of like they're having in California for the past little while, and I'll show you some pictures of that as well. So the mixing component of what's going on, I guess, is much more minor than the tidal fluctuation. And they get the higher tides in the fall versus in the spring, so the amount of runoff they get, because the time when the canals are dry happens, in March and April. So in the spring, the boats are on the bottom, and in November, you can take the boat across the sidewalk.
So to me, this looks like Florida.
Yeah.
Florida really prepare you to talk about Florida.
We don't have this problem in Florida.
The Everglades are sinking,
Yeah, but we don't have a bunch of tens of thousands of people living there either. Yeah. Another thing that's happened, another problem, is because they have these tidal gates around the city on the canals, and when the tide fluctuates like this, it exceeds the tidal gates. And so there's now sharks in Venice. Mostly small leopard sharks, less than 3 or 4 feet. And there's only ever been about a dozen of them spotted, but they've made it into Venice because during this type of a phenomenon, they can go over the top of the tidal screens that are supposed to keep the big fish out of the canals.
Do people taste like chicken?
I do not know. And they said that these are small enough, and they're not tiger sharks, they're leopard sharks, and their teeth are small enough that it would hurt, but it would not be lethal. Yeah, so and we're not going to swim in the canals anyway for reasons that we'll talk about in a few. Okay, so to solve this is the first hydrologic thing, is these high tides that we get in November. During normal tidal conditions, water levels in the city are fine. The city has spent, over the past couple of years, an exorbitant amount of money by Venetian standards, $7+ billion. And the general population doesn't believe that the Italian government is telling them the truth on how much this has actually cost, because it's gone about 4 years over time as to how long it was supposed to take to build.
Doing the hydrologist just like
Well, they didn't sue the seismic geologist. They put him in prison. So yeah, no. Actually, what they did is they built this. These are buoyed platforms that are anchored to the seafloor with these huge concrete installations, And if the tide is coming in and it's going, and they can gauge this several days in advance, they can forecast, kind of like Old Faithful, how high is the tide going to be and what's the wind going to be doing? Is it onshore or offshore? So this is flooded with water, and it's made out of steel. This weighs like 40 tons, and it sits down here in this cradle on the bottom of the floor, which is made of concrete. Well, there's a series of pumps that pump air inside of this thing, and then it raises itself up, and it's about as wide as the classroom, and sticks out of the water like a balloon made out of steel. And then you got the Adriatic on this side and the lagoon on this side, and it protects it from not only the rising tide, but the push of onshore water because of the wind.
But this is just a 2D cut. This thing is probably miles long.
Yeah, we want to see it because I have pictures. Yeah, they actually built this across all 3 of those major inlets that I showed you. So there's one of these across all 3 of it. We'll even, if we can, we want to save some other time. So there's the cartoon of what it would look like, and all of those tabs are individual pieces that rise and fall separately, and it looks kind of like that. So right here we've got every other one that has risen up. They're doing testing on it in this picture. There we've got the center open, and you can even see here with the center open that sea level on the outboard side is higher than sea level on the inboard side, and you've developed quite a nice current through the middle right there. So if they raise that one up, then it basically blocks this. So billions and billions of dollars to minimize the effects of this flooding that we have happening.
Will you spend billions over there?
No, we will not spend billions on it. Yeah, we will not be paying for it.
The tourist agenda.
Yeah, oh, the tour, yeah. It's one of the top tourist destinations in northern Italy. So, in fact, I think, the areas around Rome is probably the only place that's gonna, 250 million tourists a year or something like that. It's just an exorbitant number. So they've put it all the way up, and we could go to the YouTube video, but all it shows is that you watch as they raise these things one by one as the pumps go off. And there's submerged cameras all along the hinge line, and there's inclinometers along the hinge so they can monitor, that they're all in the same line and how high up it is and how fast it's going, and then put it back down as the tide goes back out, etc. The environmentalists were livid. Even though this would only be raised for a maximum of about 2.5 hours. During the peak of high tide. You're going to raise it just before tide crest occurs. You're going to keep it raised, and then the tide's going to start going back out, and you're going to lower it back down. So even though it would be raised maybe 10 times a year, which also brings, $7+ billion, and you're going to use it 10 or 12 times a year for 2.5 hours at a time. That's a really expensive piece of equipment for what they're going to get out of it. But if it keeps downtown Venice from flooding, then, I guess maybe money well spent if you were somebody who was living there. But it can also go the other way. So these are pictures from the springtime, and those are gondolas, and that's the bottom of the Grand Canal on the side, exposed right there. So you wanted to go for, when the tide gets low like this, or when the water's, and again, it's only for a few hours, it's only at low tide, water in the center of the channel is so restricted that only the smaller version of the public water taxis are allowed to travel. The big water taxis are too big, and the gondolas just take up too much space because everything's crowded into the center. In fact, during the high tides, when the water passes about 100 centimeters above normal, it becomes dangerous, and all water traffic is closed. So wherever you are, that is where you are. So if the sirens go off, you have to get back to your hotel, and you have to get back to your or wherever you're going to be staying at, and you have to get there now. Yeah, so a couple of cool pictures of the gondola is just sitting idle on the bottom of the canal, which in this picture appears also like it needs to be dredged, and you can see the staircases with the green death coating them. Don't step on the green death. The green death will make you very wet. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. All right. So Venice has a number of names, which I'm sure you're going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about one of them for a minute. It's called the floating, and this goes into the hydrology. It's called the floating city. It's not really a floating city. I looked and looked and looked, and I would love to know the answer. There's this James Bond movie, right? And in the James Bond movie, they have this building in Venice, is being held up by these huge airbags, okay? And I looked and looked and looked, to see if that was real. And the internet says nothing about it except it was a scene from a James Bond movie. So I think it was moderately to highly staged. There is issues with this high tide problem, and there are a number of buildings, especially historic buildings, that they have cut off. How you do this, I don't know, and I teach the engineering classes. Cut off horizontally at the water line, the low water line, hydraulically raised the building above the 118 centimeter threshold, the high tide line, and then replaced the foundation that's missing in between. Kind of like people who are born with one leg shorter than the other, they can break the bone, stretch it apart, and then grow bone in the middle. Well, they've done that to a number of buildings in Venice as a result of this. Venice actually sits on a forest. It sits on about 10 million trees. Under Venice, there's a highly compacted, very hard layer of clay, but it's underwater. The stuff at the surface is kind of like a Twinkie. So it's kind of like building buildings on sponge cake that's saturated with water. And centuries ago, somebody figured out that you could take trees and drive them into the ground as far as they would go until refusal. We do the same thing today with big buildings. We drive pilings all the time. We vibrate them in. They're doing as well as they can in that. And then you put the masonry on top of those trees. The trees have to be fully below low water. If the trees are ever exposed, if the wood is ever exposed above the low tide, the microbes will start to destroy it, like it does with the masonry on the buildings. So the trees are actually in really good shape, as you can see here in the picture during this excavation as they're reconstructing part of a wall on a canal, that because they're never exposed to the air, so there's no microbes.
But he didn't preservative at all in the wood?
No, most of these trees were put in centuries ago, like 5, 6, 8, 1,000 years ago, etc. And this is how they made the islands bigger. So we get there, and there's an island, and it's the size of one of these tables, and I build my house on it. And then, my buddy Jeff comes along, and he wants to live there too, so we drive in more trees, and we make the island bigger. And so these little islands that make up the island of Venice have basically grown through this fashion over the course of centuries and coalesced together to some extent. Now, this one I do want to show you because they did a really good job with some of these animations. And we're going to take that one, and we're going to jump back out, and we're going to leave whoever that is walking in the water, which you shouldn't do, and we're going to go here. Yeah, ad will play after. Whoa, yeah. Everybody do that, quick. Everybody do that. Come on, Scott. You can do that. You got this. We're only going to watch, this is like 15 minutes long. We're going to watch the first 2 minutes of it. If it's the same one I'm thinking, oh, no, it's not the same one I was thinking of. It's only 2 minutes long. We're still not going to watch the whole thing. I got it.
Hidden inside the Rialto Bridge is a remarkable example of the secret engineering behind this aquatic city.
Most famous bridge. Everybody wants to have their picture taken there. I'm sure that will come up in pictures.
I was hoping to do that with the glasses. Have the picture taken right there.
So if we go underneath the bridge, as they take it apart here in our... Oops, there we go. Yeah, I just want to start it over, because why not? Because I know class doesn't end until quarter after now. I can play this 5 times.
Venice's bridges are more than pedestrian walkways. Hidden inside the Rialto Bridge is a remarkable example of the secret engineering behind this aquatic city. The bridge has a double purpose. It also carries power cables, drinking water, and gas pipes. Propping the bridge up, hidden under the stone and timber, is a forest of more than 12,000 ancient tree trunks.
That's just under the footings of the bridge, 12,000 trees.
Into the layer of firm clay. The 400-year-old posts support more than 10,000 tons of weight.
It's pretty impressive.
Wooden posts like these are found all over the city. Venice's buildings stand on more than 10 million tree trunks that were harvested on the mainland hundreds of years ago. A vast forest submerged in waterlogged ground keeps the structures from sinking into the mud.
Well, it tries to. All right, I just thought that was a really cool little animation that kind of showed what's going on. So it's not really floating. They did put in a foundation. It's just not the same kind of foundation that we would consider putting in something today. The actual hydrogeology of Venice is it doesn't have any. It's an island totally saturated with seawater. There were these little teeny islands out in the middle of the lagoon, and during periods of high rain runoff, the water in the lagoon would become kind of an intermediate water. It would become brackish, and then high tide would come and wash the rainwater out of the lagoon, and it would become normal saline again. In places, the lagoon is actually slightly hypersaline. So the island itself is salt. Well, you go back historically to when the Huns were invading and people were out there on the island trying to be safe, and how do you provide drinking water to 10,000 people? You can't go back to the mainland and get it because Attila is sitting over there waiting for you. He doesn't want to ride his horse out to where you are in the muck, so you're just kind of waiting there. So they made an aquifer. They made a number of aquifers. These are wells. They're not wells in the same way that I consider them to be a well, because I spent 10 years making wells. Down into the ground, pump out fresh water, people drink it, etc., etc., etc. This is what they look like. In order to put one of these in, and these things, again, are hundreds and hundreds of years old, and most of the large squares have one of these in it. And there were huge regulations on who could install one of these. And then there were even more regulations and legislation on how they were to be used. And if somebody saw John goes walking up to one of these wells, 500 years ago, and his hands are dirty, he could be imprisoned because of the potential for what the dirt that was on his hands getting into the well. So they dig. It's going to happen sooner or later. They dig out this huge depression under the square, and then they packed into the edges of the depression clay to make it so that seawater could not infiltrate in. They lined it with fine-grained sand and then coarse-grained sand in the middle to act as a filter. Then when it rains in the square, there are most of this has been sealed over now. These still exist, and they've been retrofitted with piping so that you can actually fill up your water bottle at these fountains. But it used to be this kind of a thing. And the water would go in through these areas on the side, these small cisterns. And so basically they just made this huge tank underground out of clay and fine-grained sand and coarse sand. And this acts as a nice filter for the rainwater. And then when you need to get a bucket of water for your house, you come out and put your rope down and draw water out of the well. That's basically the hydrogeology of Venice. They made it themselves, and it's 100% artificial.
Have you ever seen this anyplace else in the
No,
world?
never. No, never. In fact, because you go on and you look up, you do Google searches on the water supply of Venice. The water supply of Venice today comes from the mainland, from a well field that's about 14 miles inland, as well as surface water that's treated at a water treatment plant. Just like we have in the United States. Italy's not a third world country. It runs through a pipeline that lays on the bottom of the lagoon, and when you drink water in Venice, it came from the mainland. But before they could do that, hundreds of years ago, this was their fresh water supply.
So how long did that last? Until about early 1800s?
1880, 1890, mid-1800s, mid to late. And some of these are still, I wouldn't say viable, but all of the tops, like we're seeing here, you can do a Google search for images, wells of Venice. And some of these are ornate and beautiful. And now the city, because they bring in water from the mainland, we saw the water pipes going underneath the Rialto Bridge. They'll have water pipes that come underneath, the pavement, and water comes out this. And you can fill up your water bottle there. And they really encourage that, by the way. Although there are, and hopefully he can talk about this, there are varying reports on whether that water is totally safe to drink or not. But bottled water is the number one consumed beverage in Venice, with the average Venetian consuming between 50 and 100 gallons of bottled water a year. Plus tourists, Venice produces more plastic waste from bottled water than any other city of comparable size in the world. but the city has put in these wells and encourages everybody to go to the well now and fill your water bottle up there because they're trying to reduce that. But on the internet, there's some varying reports, and I've never been, so that's not what I'm gonna. And this is kind of the other part. Anybody have any idea what that is?
Pretty.
Well, that's vertical right there. So that's a horizontal pipe. What do you?
Well, I was gonna say.
Yeah, it's drainage. It's drainage. That's drainage out of one of the big hotels. Things have come a long way. If we were to go to Venice 200 years ago, raw sewage, and I mean raw sewage, would be released. Back in the day, European cities, medieval cities, Italy, wherever you were, you got rid of your waste by taking the chamber pot out in front of the house and just dumping it in the gutter. And hopefully it rained soon to wash all of that away. The stench would have just been, it would have been like being at a wastewater treatment plant. I've spent some time there. I know what that's like. Venice had it really good, though. Venice, you took the chamber pot and you dumped it out the window or off of the edge into the canal. You discharged raw sewage directly into the ocean. There are still varying reports as to whether or not that happens in Venice today, and there's a lot of ecological groups that want more studies done by the government and blah, blah, blah. By law, from the Italian government, all hotels and all private residents, although that part, I guess, is much harder to enforce, are supposed to have a 3-station water treatment system in the building. So the hotel that you would stay at, on the island, all of the wastewater would go through this 3-stage water treatment system. And on the 3rd stage, not to be too, get over it, you're adults. All of the solids would be removed during the 3rd stage of purification, and then gray water would be dumped directly into the canal system. Now, we do that here in this country. We water golf courses with gray water all the time. You go to certain cities like Miami, and you've got water lines buried in the street. And some of the water lines, the junctions are painted blue, and some of the water lines, the junctions are painted gray. And these are 12 and 20-inch, iron water pipes. Well, the gray water pipes you don't want to tap because that's water from the sewer plant going to the Biscayne golf course to water the grass. And if you go play golf at 6 o'clock in the morning, sometimes there's a faint aroma. And people talk about the aroma of Venice, especially in the morning. And I don't have any knowledge of what that's like, etc. But Venice still, to this day, discharges gray water into the canal system. The tides flush through, going in and out twice a day, and that keeps everything kind of normalized, is the way I would put it. It is classified as the most primitive sewer system for a major city in the world, because there isn't a force main and a lift station and a clarifier and a rectifier and all these different things that we would have if we were building a normal wastewater treatment plant. Now, there's another island in the group 10 miles away that has a small wastewater treatment plant on it for the inhabitants. There's just no place to build one of those in Venice. Every inch of ground is taken, and it's very expensive ground. There are wastewater treatment plants on the mainland. The hotel that we're going to stay in, I am sure, has normal sewage and normal water, just like we have here. But Venice has some things that it has to overcome. So, anyway, they recommend, you really don't know if all of the homes on Venice have a 3-stage water filtration system. There's really no way for the city government to go in and verify that they do. And if they do, there's no way for the government to go in and verify that it's working properly. And so for that reason, a lot of people say swimming in the canals might not be your best friend, especially if you have a cut or something like that. But you see lots of pictures of people swimming in the canals.
My dad because he drinks water from the canal.
From the canals.
Yeah.
The canals are, in fact, part of Venice's sewer system. They really are. So when the tide rises and it floods the square, one of the shop owners in a video that I watched on YouTube said, in very broken English, after the water has come into my store, you have to mop the floor and then mop it 2 more to get the water out. And then you have to mop it 2 more times with disinfectant just to be safe. Now, that was his personal preference, I'm sure.
In third world countries, I think Naples was the last major city in the world to even get a sewage treatment plant.
Really?
Of any sort. They just pumped it out in the streets, and it was in the 70s they finally fucked up and got a sewage
treatment plant. Yeah, we're somewhat ahead of the game in that regard. But we did the same things. You go back to 1900, and we discharged so much waste and effluent and chemical byproduct, etc., directly into the St. Lawrence River, the St. Lawrence Seaway that connects the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean, that there were points in time where the surface of the seaway caught fire and burned. Fires on the water, big fires, because there's so much material out there in the water. So all of the outfalls are not quite so pretty. This is also an outfall. This one's actually below water level, which is very aesthetic. So the water level in the canal is up here. This canal has been drained to be dredged, and then very often, once they've drained the canal, they find this kind of destruction because the seawater is extremely corrosive to the brick and more so to the mortar. And then you agitate, so you've got this weakened brick and this really, really fragile mortar, especially at and right below the water line. And we're looking at low tide here and high tide here. That's the green area. This is always submerged down here, hence there's no green stuff on it, no biotics. So this area, then you agitate that water a little bit. I don't know, by like having a boat go by constantly. And this has just crumbled away. Now there's generally another layer of support behind this, and another layer of support behind that. And this wall was most likely built not so much to keep the building up, but to keep the canal open. But today, as they drain sections of the canal, and this outfall again, the waste from the building would have come down and entered inside the building basically, and then made its way out, especially at low tide, as the low tide would suck material out of that pipe. They find damage like this, and there's a slew of people that work continuously as they're always draining this section of canal to dredge and repair, and then the next section, and that's just an ongoing thing. But that's what gives us this. On that happy, cheery note, yeah, we should. All right. Because this kind of talks about the tides a little bit. So yeah, the hydrogeology of Venice is now an onshore water treatment system.
It was tongue in cheek.
Oh, I know. That's funny. You're fine. We just watched this. Don't we get credit for already having watched it?
Okay.
Is that the same one? Did it not change? Yeah, it didn't change for some reason. Just a second. Now we're going to have to watch it again. It's going to be all sorts of fun. Why did it not take that off? And for some reason, when I make links on my Mac and then I put it on a PC, none of the links are live anymore. I have no idea what's going on. There we go. We're only going to watch the first little piece of this because it talks kind of about this infrastructure that we've just gone through. I'm sure if we watched the whole 18 minutes, it would talk about all sorts of things that somebody else is going to talk about.
Venice lies in the middle of a lagoon.
I just love that word, lagoon.
Sea, but an expanse of shallow waters separated from the sea by thin strips of land. The lagoon drains and fills up again deep sea water twice a day through the 3 inlets. The water flows in, the water flows out, flows in, flows out. But is Venice an island? It is a cluster of 124 islands.
Depending on who you talk to.
Gradually populated starting in the 7th century AD. Venice did not...
So there's two. This is one version. So we started off with this island in the center, and then it grew out, and they formed these canals. That is not what happened.
Expanded over time, but out...
So there's our little teeny islands. And one of those is mine, and one of those is yours. And then your buddy shows up, so you make your island bigger, and by driving trees into the ground, and I make my island bigger, and
settlements that coalesced into one.
I just thought that was really
The main
cool.
islands were originally independent settlements that had some characteristic elements in common. A church.
I'm sure it's an LDS church.
A square. One or more rainwater collection wells.
Which we just talked about.
At least one canal at the edge of the square. If the canal is not visible, that means it was probably filled in at a later time.
All right. So that is basically what I know about the hydrogeology of Venice, which is really kind of an intriguing question. Yes.
Hey, Danny.
And now we're going to pause and hand the microphone to Danny.
And Danny went there with me 4 or 5 years ago, and he planned it carefully, and he's consulted all sorts of other experts. And he is really the brains behind school.
Well, you're very generous.
Yeah.
Well, I got some handouts. Definitely want me to take 5 minutes, so it's
You got about a half an hour.
yeah, like you probably gotta leave it about 10. So, does this even work? Can you hear me okay?
It does work.
It's for the people who are watching at home.
Oh, okay.
This is like general conference.
Okay. All right. Well, my name is Danny Olson. I work here on campus over in the administration building, director of research office over there. We do a lot of surveys for the university. So some of you may have, most likely have received surveys from our office, institutional assessments. So thank you for your response. They are used. But yeah, what I have here, this handout, is I've kind of, Jeff was too kind to me talking about the day we had there. It was one of these nice sunny days that have been shown some of these videos. And we stayed outside of, off the island as we'll be doing on this tour. And so I guess we'll be taking the bus over, or you can take the train if you don't have a bus for you. And so what I've got here is a kind of a handout. I'll just walk through it in a few minutes. And this is from one of Rick Steves' books. So he's kind of an expert on Europe and things like that. So this is the Pocket Guide to Venice. So these are just a few extracts in here, kind of showing the lay of the land and some things to see, and maybe a couple of walking tours.
I think we saw the best of Venice in the full day.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's basically what we're going to be doing.
Yeah.
We're not going to quite turn you loose, but after we get a group picture, we'll turn you loose.
Okay.
This is our last full day, so let's make
Yeah.
sure that we have everybody present down there on the main square.
So basically we'll be staying in a hotel, and then we have a full day in Venice, and then we have to be back at the hotel by 8 p.m. that night.
Bonnie, did you have a question?
Did you go to the island of Murano?
I didn't. I can do that this time.
Can we go off on our own for a little bit to go over there?
Yes. But so initially we'll just stay together, and then you can go where you want. Chris,
Yeah.
Any insights on the island of Murano?
I want to go there too. Although, you know what, I have heard, I have my degree teacher said you can get a lot of the same stuff at better prices. Well, I don't want to buy stuff,
Okay.
but you can't save going as much as they do.
So anyway, just quickly on this first page, the top left you'll see the don't miss with three triangles. Try hard to see with 2, and then 1 is worthwhile if you can make it. Basically, it says that you can walk across Venice in an hour. Not that big. So most things are within 20 minutes of St. Mark's Square. So you could walk all the way to Rialto Bridge, or you could take for €7 you can get on this water bus, and you can get off and on as many times as you want, depending on what stops that are available within 45 minutes. So you could take the water bus up to Rialto Bridge, take a picture, or walk up there, and then go on up to St. Mark's Square. Jeff and I took it all the way up to St. Mark's Square, then we just walked all the way back, spent the day, and stopping at a few gelato shops on the way and things like that. But so the bottom half on the first page, you can see sort of at a glance, it lists some of the main attractions, and they're kind of sorted in, his opinion of what you should see and whatnot. As said, there's St. Mark's Square, St. Mark's Basilica, Doge's Palace, Rialto Bridge. Those are kind of the main things. But there's a little more on the page you can look at, as well as the book. This book's like under $10 if you said you wanted it. Looking on the next page, this kind of tells you what's open by day. On Monday, it says all sites are open except a few that are listed there. The fish market, I'm sure that's high demand. Just kidding. So he says avoid midday crowds at St. Mark's, but I guess just follow how that flows. The bottom of the second page, you can see kind of the layout of the events. So you can see at the top left, you can see the station there. That's kind of where we'll get off, and then the canal kind of winds around like a snake. And at the bottom, you can see St. Mark's down there in Doge's Palace. So on page 3, maps out the Grand Canal, and then there's this with different things marked on the map. And then there's a walk here from St. Mark's Square that's mapped out that says it takes about an hour if you want to walk. It goes on up to Rialto Bridge and then back down. So these are just different walks for people if they want to walk.
I can't imagine you'd want to spend less than 4 days. There's so much to see.
Yeah.
And,
3 or 4 different types of architecture, from Roman to Gothic
Yeah.
to.
that's right.
Yeah.
And I think the areas around St. Mark's Square, you've got to go in
Yeah.
just about everything they suggest.
Yeah.
Including the Doge's Palace, which is basically the dungeon and other things like
Yeah,
that. The
exactly.
armory.
Exactly.
It was tremendous.
And the churches. So these are just some possible walks. And on the last page on the back, there's another walk at St. Mark's Square, walking over to the San Zaccaria. And so those are short walks. Then on the bottom, there's another walk on the other side of the canal from Rialto Bridge over to Ferrari Church. And that's kind of where it's noted for some of the best art in Venice, is in that church. So
Where did we see the Stradivarius? Where we saw those?
I don't remember. Somewhere.
Somewhere, yes.
So anyway, there's lots of nooks and crannies, a lot of little alleys, and sometimes just there's walks. Depends on how much walking you want to do, but a lot of stuff's mainly around that main square. And if you want to go up the waterway, I mean, the water buses are pretty. I think they're about €7 or so.
It's pretty good food.
But it's walkable, yeah. So.
And it shouldn't be flooded.
So some of the restaurants have, live music going. You remember that, and violins are out, and so hopefully we'll be there when there's water in the canal or it's not flooded.
We want to be there I think those are extremes, and so I think it's likely that we'll get normal, because I think the extremes are only tightly related. So
Yeah.
even if it was dry, the tide would come back up and everything go back to normal for a few hours.
So I don't know if we have to be back to the hotel at 8 o'clock. What time we have to be back to where the bus is going to stay down there at the where the train station is at the end.
I don't know if it'll stay or go back.
I'll go back. Okay, or
We'll
it'll-
try
Do whatever we ask them.
the bus will pick us up there though at a certain time. Okay.
Don't be late.
All right. So
Any questions?
there's a lot to see there and a lot of history.
Do
So
not drink the water in the canal. Do not. In fact, do not
I
swim
would
in the
just like
canal.
water.
The sewage problem was so bad in the 70s and 80s that they would have massive algal blooms, which would turn the water the color of your shirt.
Hmm.
Yeah, really nasty.
all right. So
Any
I've got
questions?
my son in the back, Dustin. He's going to be joining us. You can say hi, Dustin. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. You bet. You bet.
So we're done for the day. Great spring break. What is it, 4 or 5 days of spring break now?
It's like one day that most people.
And when is it?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow is the spring
Nice.
break.
I like it. Sucks to be you.
Is this still expected? Like, will most of you guys be here?
We'll be off to the
No,
Bahamas.
we don't get up. You guys can get
The
up.
professors and
The
the
students get up, the faculty get up. We don't get up. Yeah, I already know. So you see that, yeah. Like, apply yourself. Because I know some.
Good times.
Yeah, I've got to go. Oh, yeah.
I had a good friend of mine who had conserved his mission.
Really?
And
Way
it's kind
cool.
of fun when I found out about this trip. Oh, that's pretty neat. Because
Yeah.
we'll actually be kind of following him around his mission.
Oh, really?
So I told him to, as a going through all these spaces. Tell me all the mission stories.
Oh, yeah.
Those locations.
That's cool. That chair's possessed. That is way cool. It'll be fun. I'm interested to see what it smells like.
I'm also going to see if I can learn a little bit about Italian before I go.
Arrivederci. That's what I know. T-Rex is the same in every language.
So all we did was